All right, we return to our series after a couple of weeks on the Bible and politics, and we are considering presently the several ways available to curb the abuse of power by government. And in our American system, just by way of review, we have 5 tribunals to veto laws and check the potential abuse of power, those being the House of Representatives, the Senate, the executive, which would be our president, or if in the state, the governor, the judicial, the court system, and the jury, where in the jury can actually fly in the face of the law and the facts and acquit somebody guilty of breaking the law, which they have done in the past, and the Supreme Court recognizes their right to do so, and thus veto laws that they consider to be an abuse of power. We also saw that free and fair elections are a way to curb the abuse of power, because in elections, candidates and issues can be rejected if the people judge them to be abusive of power. And then the freedoms guaranteed to Americans in the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, we find there ways to curb the abuse of power, such as the freedom of speech in the press, wherein we can openly express our opposition to policies of government. The right of the people to peacefully assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances is another way. We can take to the streets and protest of things we consider to be abuses of power. Third, and also the worship of God. This is all guaranteed in the first amendment of the Bill of Rights. And the worship of God, the free exercise, therefore, is most definitely a way that we can curb the abuse of power. Then the right of the people to bear arms, which is stated in the Second Amendment of the Bill of Rights, is a curb to the abuse of power by government. An armed citizenry is definitely a threat to any government that wants to overextend and abuse its power. And then we considered civil disobedience, and that is you just flatly disobey a law. And what that does is it can awaken the public to the injustice of the law and can cause its constitutionality to be tested in a court of law. It's forcing the issue and forcing the system to have to deal with it. And we gave you a couple of examples of that, and also a statement by Martin Luther King about utilizing civil disobedience to make the public aware of injustice. And then we last time concluded with the thought that when the means that we have within the system fail in resisting the abuse of power, another means of resistance is by revolution. And we pointed out that the right of revolution against a government is established only when it's successful. If it's unsuccessful, then those who attempt it will be treated as treasonous. Revolution incurs great risk and should only be taken and should not be undertaken for light or transient causes, as was stated in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. We find in Scripture examples of just revolutions. We pointed that out. And then we pointed out that before revolution, there needs to be reformation. If there is not the reformation of a people before revolution, then the revolution will either collapse or lead to another form of tyranny as bad or worse. And whenever considering revolution, always know the character and principles of a given resistance movement. You don't want to align yourself with something that's being led by fools and ungodly people. And then one last consideration about revolution, and that is we should avoid romantic revolution, which will result in suicidal martyrdom. For example, had I been living under the communist regime in Russia, yes, I could have gone out into Red Square and screamed that communists are thieves and the communist government is a lie, and I would have gotten myself dead. That's about what that resistance would have cost me, and it would have been a foolhardy thing to do. Because you see, our goal is not martyrdom. Our goal in engaging in a revolution, should we ever do so, or even as Christians facing persecution, our goal is not martyrdom. Psalm 30 and verse 9 says, what profit is there, this Psalm 30 and verse 9, what profit is there in my blood when I go down to the pit? Shall the dust praise thee? Shall it declare thy truth? Unnecessary martyrdom simply silences a voice that can, under other circumstances, speak the truth and speak against evil and oppression. If martyrdom were the goal, why do we find, and we do find this, as I'll show you, why do we find biblical characters trying to escape for their lives? Why didn't they just go out and let themselves be killed? For example, in 1 Samuel 19 and verse 10, 1 Samuel 19:10, and Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Rather than just standing there and becoming a martyr, David escaped. That was the smart thing to do. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, when Absalom had committed insurrection and had seized the power of government against David, his father, we read in 2 Samuel 15, 13 and 14, and David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. David was smart enough to realize that the resistance that Absalom had mounted at this point was too great for him to try to withstand. And so under these circumstances, the thing to do was to run, to escape for his life from the life of his servants, and then regroup and mount a resistance later on. And then in 2 Corinthians, to give a New Testament example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verses 32 and 33, the Apostle Paul says that in Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison desirous to apprehend me. And through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. So here Paul was facing persecution and potential martyrdom, and instead of just going ahead and letting himself be killed, he escaped in a basket let down over a wall. So if martyrdom were the goal, we wouldn't find these biblical characters trying to escape for their lives. And so if martyrdom can be avoided, it ought to be, but sometimes it may not be. If one is apprehended and delivered up to martyrdom, then as a Christian, he should endure it after the example of Christ. 1 Peter chapter 2, 20 through 23. Endure martyrdom after the example of Christ. We read 1 Peter 2, 20 through 23. For what glory is it when ye be buffeted for your faults? Ye shall take it patiently. But if when ye do well and suffer for it, ye take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Now watch. Who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. So if you are ever delivered up to martyrdom, you don't want to go to the guillotine or the firing squad, giving them the finger and screaming invectives and curses at them and so forth. You want to go to it and endure it in the patience of Christ, as he quietly, as a lamb to the slaughter. Now, I want you to turn to Romans 13, and I'm going to lift out some thoughts and quotes that I found in a book that was written by Chuck Baldwin and his son Timothy Baldwin. The book is entitled Romans 13, The True Meaning of Submission. Now, quite frankly, in my opinion, I don't think the book was well written, but I think there is some tremendous information in the book if you want to read it. And I've garnered some things here that I want to share with you tonight. And what I want to show you is that we are not required to render to civil government unqualified obedience. There is a limitation to how much submission we owe to civil government. But before I do that, I want to read Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Romans 13, 1 through 7. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. 4. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister, the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. It should be obvious from the reading of this passage that this is dealing with proper government, functioning as God has ordained it to function, to praise those that do well, protect those that do well, and to punish those that do evil. In other words, to execute justice. So this is dealing in context with the proper function of civil government. Now, civil government is given power. He speaks of that here, how they possess power, and it is the power to execute justice. Now, to say that because government has power from God, and it does, that it may do whatever it wants, would be like saying because fire has power to burn, one can use fire any way one wants. It's ridiculous. Because fire has power to burn, there's limitations on how you use it. Otherwise, it's easy to abuse it. Well, the same pertains to the power possessed by government. Just because they have power, that does not give them the right. Get the distinction here. Because they have the power, that does not give them the right to just do any and everything they want to do. They were not ordained by God for that. They were ordained by God for the execution of justice. And there is a limit with respect to the powers that we are to submit to. For example, Satan is the prince of this world. Must we submit to him? Absolutely not. In fact, we are taught the opposite. We are taught to resist the devil, and he will flee from us, in James chapter 4. Now, it is a fact that God allows governments to do evil things. He has done that throughout history. We can give numerous Bible examples, but we don't need to live outside the boundary of our own personal experience to know that governments engage in evil things. And God allows it, because no evil can take place without the permissive decree of God. But that God allows evil to take place does not argue that he approves it, or that we must unconditionally submit to it. God might allow somebody to try to kill me, but because God allows that person to try to kill me doesn't mean that I have to let them kill me. I have every right to resist their efforts to do so. We just saw examples of that in those that escaped from those that would endeavor to take their life. We just saw that. So because God allows something doesn't mean he approves it, and doesn't mean we necessarily have to submit to it. Now, this is a quote. I thought it was very good, and it references when Absalom seized the power of government from David, when he committed sedition and insurrection against his own father's government. And the quote goes like this: "Were brute force and mere allegiance of the people." Now, those were two things Absalom had. He had brute force that he exerted, and he had a large allegiance of the people behind him. Were brute force and mere allegiance of the people the only factors of God's ordination, David would not have been justified in attempting to regain control of his kingdom, which he did, away from Absalom. Nor was he justified in describing Absalom's exercise of his higher powers as being evil, which David did. And Absalom's lust for power and accomplishment of the same were all that was necessary to qualify him as God's minister. What he's pointing out is the fact that Absalom had a lust for power and the fact that Absalom achieved power doesn't necessarily mean he was God's minister. It didn't qualify him to be a power ordained of God as God's minister, because he was certainly not about executing justice when he was going about to try to kill his own father and the very man that God had ordained and appointed to be the governor and king of Israel. So brute force and mere allegiance of people don't necessarily constitute a government as ordained of God. Now, the question is asked, what is de jure higher power? We're talking here in Romans 13 about submitting to higher powers. What is de jure higher power? Now, that word de jure means higher power by right. It's a Latin expression, means by right or by justice. Okay, that's de jure power. Then there's also de facto power. There's de jure power, that's power by right. And then there's de facto power that may be right and it may not be right. It's just the facts of the case. They are the power, whether it's right or wrong. So what is de jure higher power? What is just government? What is right government? That's the question. And that question is answered in 2 Samuel 23:3. 2 Samuel 23:3. De jure higher power is defined thusly. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spake to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. So when you have a higher power that is not just and has no fear of God, you're not dealing with a de jure higher power. He that ruleth over men must be just, execute justice, ruling in the fear of God. So you cannot expect a de jure government from an atheistic state such as you have in communist countries. You are going to have the abuse of power. You're going to have injustice when men do not even acknowledge God. Now, if men can rightfully defend themselves, if they cannot rightly defend themselves against what threatens them, including threats from the government, the civil government, if men cannot rightly defend themselves against what threatens them, then they are worse off than brute beasts. There's one thing we know about brute beasts. When they're put in a position where they have to defend themselves, they will fight back. They will fight for their life. They will fight to defend their young. And if we don't have the right to do that, then we aren't any better off than they. In fact, we're worse off than brute beasts who apparently were endowed by God with the instinct to defend themselves when they have to. Now, here's another quote from the book. How can individuals and society not have God's ordination to inflict injustice upon others, yet the agent of the people and minister of God possess that arbitrary and unjust power? In other words, I as an individual do not have the right to inflict injustice on others as an individual under the law of God. And if I as an individual don't have the right to inflict injustice, then neither does the representative of people, the government, the civil government, have that right. They have no more right to inflict injustice as a body politic than an individual has. That just makes sense. They're under the same law of God that every individual is, that forbids the execution of injustice against another. Excuse me. And then another quote. However, being overcome by force does not mean the innocent have no right to resist. And so when the Nazis forced their way into France and took it over and ruled over it, that didn't mean that the French didn't have a right to resist, because they did. There was an underground French resistance movement, and it was certainly nothing wrong with that, as they tried to save people that might otherwise have been killed or imprisoned by the Nazis, and do what they could to try to break the power that they had exercised over them. Being overcome by force does not mean the innocent have no right to resist. And then this interesting comparison I found in the book. A prophet's position and power. Let's think about the prophets in the Bible. A prophet's position and power did not decide his ordination of God, but rather the merits of his prophecy. A man might claim to be a prophet of God and occupy a position of power as a prophet, but if he uttered a false prophecy, that proved he was not ordained of God as a prophet. So the prophet's position and power didn't determine his ordination of God, but rather the merits of his prophecy. And the same applies to any minister of God, including a government official. His position and power does not of itself decide that he's ordained of God to do what he does. Rather, the merits of what he does proves that. And then, here's just a simple statement. Robbery is robbery, regardless of the position of those robbing. Do governments rob? Do government officials rob? We've already seen verses that plainly teach that. We saw in Isaiah 1 where he said the princes were companions of thieves. And we saw in Ezekiel 22 about the princes were like grievous wolves ravening upon the prey. And so robbery is robbery, regardless of the position of those robbing. And so it is a fact that governments can, through legal means and unjust taxation, take from people what they don't have a right to take. It didn't matter whether you owned property or not when the communist revolution took place in Russia. You might have owned an estate and a house. They just came in and took it. They had the power. They had they had enough of the people behind them. They had the force. They just went in and took it in the name of the revolution when they had no right to it whatsoever. It was nothing more than sheer thievery. And if you think that can't happen in Canada, if you think that can't happen in the United States, if you think that can't happen in Chile or wherever else anybody may happen to be that's listening to this message, you underestimate the potential of human depravity, and you are naive. Remember, if man is totally depraved, well, then you can expect collective man to be all the more depraved. That's why we have checks and balances in our system, and let's hope and pray to God that stays that way so that government does not have unlimited, unchecked power. Now, it follows, and this is another quote from the book, it follows that higher powers have no rightful authority to violate what individuals cannot violate. We've already seen that point. If I as an individual don't have a right to steal from another, neither does the government. If I don't have a right to kill, to take life unjustly, then neither does the government. If I don't have a right to bear false witness against my neighbor, then neither does the government have a right through its propaganda to bear false witness against those that are exposing its evil. It follows that higher powers have no rightful authority to violate what individuals cannot violate. Now, this is a very interesting point. Romans 13 does not teach that higher powers exist perpetually in the same form, persons, and territory. And that's true throughout history. Forms of government change, those persons in government change, and actually whole systems of government change. Romans 13 does not teach that higher powers exist perpetually in the same form, persons, and territory. Take the history of the United States. Part of the United States today was once governed by Spain, other parts by France. And then, after a while, the whole was governed by England. And then the citizens of the United States, the people of the United States, overthrew the English yoke and established their own government as the United States of America. So again, Romans 13 is not teaching that higher powers exist perpetually in the same form, persons, and territory. So it follows, if past revolutions were unlawful, then how can the existing government that arose from that revolution be lawful? I mean, I've known of preachers that will say they believe the American Revolution was unjust and unlawful. Well, then why are they submitting to the government of the United States if its very establishment was unlawful? Why aren't they submitting to the King of England instead? Why don't they move to England or to some country that's under part of the English Commonwealth, rather than stay here and submit to something that they believe began in an unlawful act? If past revolutions were unlawful, like the American Revolution, then how can the existing government that arose from that revolution be lawful? That's a very good question. And then this quote: "The force of the strongest persons in society has nothing to do with rightness, justice, or conscience." Just because somebody has power enough to force that way, their way, doesn't automatically mean they're right, they're just, and acting in good conscience. The force of the strongest persons in society has nothing to do with rightness, justice, or conscience. In other words, might doesn't necessarily make right. That's in essence what that sentence, that quote, is setting forth. Then look at Luke chapter 12 and verse 39, and notice how our Lord in this parable acknowledges a basic right that we all have. In Luke 12:39, "And this know, that if the goodman of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken through." Now, the good Lord is letting us know right there that we have a right to protect our house. We have a right to protect our property. And if we know a thief is coming, we have every right to be on our guard against that thief taking our property. He's acknowledging the right to protect property from an invading thief. Now, if the government becomes an invading thief, and governments have in history, in past history, take the Communist Revolution, I just cited that, governments have had in the past a history of being invading thieves, then there's nothing wrong with the people taking measures to protect their property from that invading thief. For example, in the days of Gideon, the Midianites had taken over, and they were expropriating the property of the people. And when God called Gideon to be the deliverer of Israel, you know what he was doing? He was threshing wheat to hide it from the Midianites. This is an example of what we might call black market or underground economy, where people are they're taking their property and they're hiding it and they're sequestering it from being seized by the government or the power at that time, which in this case was the Midianites. So there you have it. So let's say, for example, the government issues a decree that no American citizen can own a gun, which of course is unconstitutional, violates our Second Amendment rights. But let's say they just pitch the Constitution and say that we want to seize all the guns of all the American citizens. There would be absolutely nothing wrong with you hiding a weapon, and maybe even turning one over to the government authority that comes to your door so that it looks like you're complying, when in reality, underground, you're, as it were, threshing wheat to hide it from the Midianites. So because God has given you the right to your property that you worked for and bought, and the right to defend it and the right to protect it. Luke 12:39 acknowledges that. And then when you look at the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments necessitate, by their very nature, the protection of one's right to life, thou shalt not kill, and one's right to property, thou shalt not steal. Now, the Ten Commandments necessitate the protection of one's right to life and one's right to property. And if I have a right to my life and I have a right to my property, I have a right to my freedom. Because if I cannot protect my life, if I cannot protect my property, then I have no liberty, no freedom. The very right to life and the right to property itself is a guarantee of personal liberty. Property rights are an integral part of liberty. So we can say that the Ten Commandments necessitate the protection of one's right to life, liberty, and property. Now, we have in our country a welfare system, and I talked about this already, how that by means of taxation, the government can take money from me and give it to people that, were it left to my discretion, I would not give them that money because I don't think they are worthy of it. So giving out of love is charity, but giving out of force is robbery. When I am forced to give by forced taxation, and then that money is given to somebody that doesn't have a right to it and doesn't deserve it, that's robbery, or the biblical word extortion, which is taking somebody's property by abuse of legal means, as in this case, legalized theft. Then there is that statement that was made by our Lord in Matthew chapter 22, when he said in Matthew 22:21, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Commenting on this particular verse, I have this quote from the book: "Rightful belonging, that which is Caesar's, rightful belonging never rests with those who obtain possession unlawfully." When the communist regime seized the property of its citizens in the name of the revolution, they may have possessed the property, but they did not possess it lawfully. It was not rightfully theirs, though they claimed it. And the same could be said for Caesar. What Caesar did not seize lawfully would not be rightfully Caesar's. That's the argument on that. Now, with what Romans 13 dismisses, what in Romans 13, no, pardon me, this is a question. I'm starting out as though it's not, and let me phrase it in the tone of a question, and then it'll make sense. What in Romans 13 dismisses the notion of submission to foreign higher powers as opposed to national higher powers? Let me show you what's being asked here. You go back to Romans 13 in verse 1. It says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers." Now, are those the national higher powers? Or does that higher powers also include foreign powers? Well, it's obvious we're not required to submit to foreign powers. The requirement is to national powers, the powers under which we reside and who have jurisdiction over us. But the question is asked, what in Romans 13 dismisses the notion of submission to foreign higher powers as opposed to national higher powers? And then this conclusion comes from that question. There are obvious limitations on these higher powers to which submission is required. These higher powers are limited. I'm required to submit to the higher powers that have jurisdiction over me, not to the higher powers that don't. So just as there are obvious limitations on the higher powers to which submission is required, there are obvious limitations to the submission required to be rendered. Let's go back to the very first study. Only God has absolute sovereignty, and only God has absolute right to absolute unqualified obedience. Every other authority cannot demand unqualified obedience. Only God has that right. Every other obedience we owe to any other authority, whether it be to a father, a husband, a civil government official, or a pastor, or a boss on the job, is a qualified and therefore limited submission. And then I thought this was very interesting in Proverbs 17:26. Proverbs 17:26 says, "Also to punish the just is not good, nor to strike princes for equity." And in the book, they pointed out that this statement can be said inversely, that if it's not good to punish the just, then it is good to punish the unjust. And if it's not good to strike princes for equity, it is good to strike princes for inequity. And that's exactly why we have checks and balances in our Constitution. For example, when the COVID-19 broke out, the governor of Michigan was issuing executive orders right and left without getting legislative approval, right and left. Well, that got taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Michigan ruled that this issuing of executive orders was not constitutional. This was a situation where she got struck by the courts. And if what she was doing was not equitable, then it was a good thing It was a good thing that the courts struck her for inequity. So again, if it's not good to punish the just, it's good to punish the unjust. And if it's not good to strike princes for equity, it is good to strike them for inequity. And then lastly, this quotation from the book. Even while scriptures proscribe a servant from rebelling against a master that has a not so gentle disposition. Now let me give you the verse they're taking that thought from. It's found in 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 Peter 2, verses 18 and verse 18. 1 Peter 2:18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the forward. So with that verse in mind, we go back and pick up the quote again. Even while scriptures proscribe a servant from rebelling against a master that has a not so gentle disposition, the same submission does not apply where a master harms the servant or even his tooth, as scriptures reveal. And they're referencing Exodus 21, 26, and 27, if you'd like to turn there. This shows again a limit on human powers, human authority, so that they're not free to abuse that power against those who are under it. In Exodus 21, 26 and 27, Exodus 21, 26 and 27. And if a man smite the eye of his servant, see, this was a case where you had slavery, and there were laws that were protecting slaves from the abuse of power. If a man smite the eye of his servant, or the eye of his maid, that would be a woman's servant, that it perish, he shall let him go free, which argues that before this he wasn't free, which means he was a slave. But if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. So you see, he didn't just have unlimited power to abuse his servants and beat up on them. If he should happen to abuse them in the loss of an eye or a tooth, the servant was permitted to go free and no longer submit to that unjust servitude. So that is showing right there a limit to human authority. They do not have the right to abuse their power. Now, and so with all of that said, this is a fact. We have the country in the United States that we have because there have been people throughout our history that have said no to the abuse of power. And we can thank God that there have been those that said no to the abuse of power. That's why we have the country we have. That's why we have the freedoms that we have. And we will lose those freedoms if we lose people that are willing from time to time to say no to the abuse of power. Even the holy apostles recognized a limit to the obedience to civil and ecclesiastical authority. We see, for example, in Acts chapter 4, 18 through 20, Acts 4, 18 through 20. And they call them, these are the ecclesiastical authorities, call them, that is the apostles, and commanded them not to speak at all nor teach in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said unto them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. In other words, you can command us all you want. We're going to teach and preach in the name of Jesus because we must obey God before obeying you, thus recognizing a limit to their authority. And then in Acts chapter 5, 27 through 29, and when they had brought them, that is the apostles, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And we read where they just did that. And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men, thus acknowledging a limit to obedience owed to civil and ecclesiastical authority. Now, for the last thing that I'd like to cover in this series, that pretty well covers the issue of the limit of civil authority and the fact that there are times, places, and occasions to say no. They just don't have unlimited authority. And just because they say they do doesn't mean they do. Like I say, just because they say they have a right to your firearm doesn't mean you have to turn it over. Or because they say they have a right to know about all of your financial transactions doesn't mean you have to let them in on it. You don't. You have a right to privacy in your financial transactions. And of course, we fools have sacrificed that by doing most of our financial transactions online, where it can all be tracked and traced. We did that. So if we suffer consequences for that, we have nobody but to blame but ourselves. After all, I like it. It's convenient. Remember that? Anyway, let me get off of that. So, and I do it too, so we all bear culpability in this. Now, lastly, in dealing with the subject of the Bible and politics, do not expect perfection in any human political system. Do not. And understand that there will be imperfections and injustices in inequities in most any system of a human political system. And we cannot resist all injustice. While there is time and place to do that, we cannot resist it all. Only God can do that. Only God. Turn to Job chapter 4, verses 10 through 14 to see this. Job chapter, did I say 4? I'm sorry, I meant 40. Job 40, 10 through 14. Job 40, 10 through 14. I'm asking you if I said 4. How are you going to answer me? You're all muted. Anyway, Job 40 and verse 10. God says to Job, deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud and abase him. Can you do that? Of course you can't. Only God can. Look on everyone that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together and bind their faces in secret. Do all that, Job, then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. In other words, this is impossible. We cannot possibly resist or right all injustice. Only God can do that. So we're limited in what injustices we can resist. And owing to our limitations, we have to wisely pick our battles and decide which hill is worth dying on. Sometimes the best thing to do is just go along with it, because you realize you don't have the wherewithal to overthrow it. To try to overthrow it is only to just cut out difficulty for yourself or compromise yourself in a way that's not necessary. Again, sometimes it's best just to duck and hide rather to go out and try to confront. In Luke, just try to conduct your business under the radar as much as possible, like they did in communist countries in the underground church where they would meet in secret. In Luke chapter 14, 31 through 32, Jesus had this piece of wisdom to give us. In Luke 14, 31 through 32, or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first, and counteth and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth ambassage and desireth conditions of peace. This is a king that realizes that this is a battle he just simply is not going to win. And so he gives in on that one. It's just not worth the risk. So again, we cannot resist all injustice. So we have to pick our battles and decide which hill is worth dying on. And understand that God will ultimately sort out all political injustice. God will ultimately sort out all political injustice. And this is taught plainly in the book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, 16 and 17, Solomon said, and moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there. So we should not be surprised to find wickedness in the halls of government and in the courts, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. We find it even in the church, even in religious places. We find it. I've been shocked at times to discover some of the wickedness that's been covered, been hidden even in our own congregation, that God eventually brought to light. I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is time there for every purpose and for every work. And so while, yes, there is wickedness in the place of judgment, that is, in the place of government, and in the place of righteousness, which government should be, that don't think they'll get away with it. God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. He has set his time to do so, and he will do so. And then Ecclesiastes 5:8, which you've heard me reference often in this context, if thou seest oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of justice, of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. And so God in heaven is watching and taking note of what governments do in terms of good and of evil. And while we may not be able to resist it, or we might not be able to overthrow it, they will have their day, for God is their judge. Remember, he is the head of all principality and power. Power is his to give, and power is his to take, and they can go no further than he will permit. So as far as to what degree we resist, how we go about resisting, it takes wisdom to judge the merit of the cause, the odds of winning, and if there might not be another way to take that involves less risk, then that would probably be the way you'd want to go. So that's that. And I'm going to close with a quote from James Madison. As I said, we do not expect perfection in any human political system. And having said that, before I read Mr. Madison's quote and wrap this up, and looks like we're going to wrap up a little early, I thought we might go over. I was hoping, and my hope is going to be realized, that I would finish this series tonight. But before I read this quote, I just want you to remember this one thing. Consider your governor, your premier, your president, your mayor, whatever. It is very easy for us to criticize what they do and the decisions that they make. And thank God we have the right to. And thank God we can do so openly. Thank God we have that freedom. It is very easy for us to criticize them. But when you do that, as you do that, just stop and just allow yourself to think, if I were in their shoes, facing what they're facing, with the information that I had available to me, what would I do? What would I do? It's easy for you to say what you would do sitting here in the comfort of your own home and your own office when you don't have to do it. It's kind of like somebody that thinks they know better than I know how to do my job when they don't face what I face, they don't know what I know, and they don't have the information coming at them that I have. So just remember that when you're criticizing your political leaders, that were you sitting where they're sitting, you might not be doing differently than they're doing. I mean, it's worth just stopping and allowing yourself to think that. So in conclusion, I give a quote from one of our fathers, the man that was called the father of the Constitution, fourth president of the United States, James Madison. Mr. Madison wrote, "Cool and candid people." And boy, that's what we want to be, a cool and candid people, not people that are carried away with rashness and emotion. Cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them. And that's true. The purest blessings have a portion of alloy in them. That the choice must always be made, if not of a lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect good. And that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. Let me read that again. Cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them. There is no system of government that is perfect. There is not going to be any system of government that executes absolutely flawless justice. None of them. No father perfectly disciplines his family. No parents perfectly discipline their children. No boss perfectly runs a company, and no pastor perfectly runs a church. Believe you me, I've made my mistakes. So all human blessings have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect good, and that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. May God have mercy and bless the truth that I've endeavored to utter, and bless the reasoning that I've endeavored to advance. And if there's any error, may He pardon it, for it was not so intended. And if you see anything there that was inconsistent or doesn't follow, you're welcome to let me know, because again, I am not flawless in things that I do.